on Africa. The session aims to determine a clear path forward in respect of possible collaborations between IAFFE, ACEIR, other pertinent African institutions, and conference attendees. And the session is hosted by ACEIR in partnership with the Women in Leadership in Economics project led by Ashwini Deshpande of the International Economic Association. I would like to introduce our 4 panelists. We have 1 panelist online, and then we have 3 in person. I will introduce them quickly and give an idea of the structure of today's event, and then we will proceed. So our first panelist is Raquel Fernandez. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And she's an economist and currently the Julia Silva, Roslyn S. Silva, and Enid Silva Winslow Professor of Economics at New York University. She's also a fellow of the Econometric Society. And her research focuses on economic inequality, cultural economics, development economics, gender economics, and sovereign debt. Our second panelist is Priscilla Chumesi Bafo, and she holds a PhD in economics from the School of Economics, University of Nottingham, University of Ghana, University of United Kingdom, I beg your pardon. This was after the completion of both a BA and Master of Philosophy in Economics from the University of Ghana. She is currently a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics at the University of Ghana and has been affiliated with the Center for Research in Economic Development and International Trade Credit, School of Economics, University of Nottingham, and also with the African Economic Research Consortium. Our third panelist is Libohang Diapolo Feko. She's an activist, scholar, academic, international movement builder, and decolonial African feminist of over 25 years standing. And her research interests are in African political economy, states and nationhood, international trade and global finance governance, feminization of poverty and social reproduction, regional integration, and impacts of globalization on labor migration. She is the Senior Research Fellow at Feminist, Senior Research Fellow and Feminist Activist and Advocacy Think Tank, Trade Collective, Founding Fellow of the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute, and has taught international trade, African feminist theory, international development political economy, and decolonial studies across the world. And she's also a Lancet Commissioner on Reparations, an ambassador of the Wellbeing Economy Global Alliance, and an African Futures Fellow. Our fourth panelist is Daniela Casal, and she's a professor in the School of Economics and Finance at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. Daniela has been in academia for the last 25 years and engaged in research in the field of feminist economics for almost as long. Other cross-cutting areas of study include labor, household health and education economics. And she's currently an associate editor at Development Southern Africa and president-elect of the Economic Society of South Africa. So these are our panelists. So in terms of the structure, we are hoping that we can have an interactive session. So we don't spend long periods of time with our panelists making presentations. So we will begin with Raquel giving us an introduction to the Women in Leadership and Economics Initiative. We will then have short comments from our panelists, open up the floor for discussion, and then come back again. So I'm hoping we can have an interactive and interesting meeting this afternoon. Thank you. So Raquel, if you can begin, please. And you've got 10 minutes.
Okay. First of all, thank you for that introduction, Abena, and thanks you to the other panelists for participating in this. I'll spend a bit of time telling you not really what we've accomplished so far, which is close to zero in that sense that we're in early stages and we've mostly been setting things up, but also just telling you what the plans are. First thing, I'd like to say that I'm here with two hats on. One is as part of this IEA-WE project. And then within that IEA-WE project, we also got money for WELAC. WELAC is a Women in Economics in Latin American Caribbean. It is the women's arm or subcommittee, as you like, of the Latin American Caribbean Economic Association. For those of you who don't know what the Latin American Caribbean Association is, it's called ACEIR. ACEIR is the equivalent of the European Economic Association in the US, and it's the equivalent, therefore, also of the in Europe, and it's equivalent of the AEA in the United States. So I'm going to talk to you about both parts because they're quite complementary, and yet they have a slightly different focus, and I think that might interest you. So first of all, the team. The team has 5 core members. In addition to Ashwini, there is Inés Barniel, who is at CEDLAS and Universidad de La Plata. Fiona Tragena, who is at University of Cape Town. Danny Roderick, who initiated this at IEA, and of course myself. Okay, so the objective of the grant was in part framed by also what we saw as the possibilities of what a grant could be. And that was to increase the presence of women in leadership in economics. So you should keep that in mind. And the idea was to think about what the structural barriers are and hopefully help to dismantle via what we find and via interactions among academia in general, some of these structural barriers, if not all of them. The grant has, I would say, 2 components. One component is the creation of a research and evidence base. So unlike other programs which might focus on the US or on Europe, our program explicitly focused on the developing world. So when we're talking about women in leadership, we're talking about women in leadership, but also from continents other than the US and Europe. So what we did was to choose 3 countries in Latin America. They're Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico. 3 countries in Africa, South Africa, Ghana, and Senegal. And 1 country in Asia, which is India. We can talk about how much thought went into the choice of countries. I would say not as much maybe as one could have put into it. And a lot of it was driven by, what we thought would work, where we think economics is being done, but also maybe for some diversity, especially when it came to Africa, thinking about Francophone versus non-Francophone countries, for example. In any case, 7 countries is quite a few, as you're going to see. So the part that we think of as creating an evidence base and creating ideas about what might work had 3 important components, I'd say. One is data gathering. So the question was, where are the biggest structural barriers to women participating fully in economics and eventually assuming leadership positions? So you might think this can start, depending on your country's education system, at high school, in the sense of who goes on to become an economist. In the US and in some other universities, this is actually decided, midway through college. So also thinking about college, graduate school, and then all the stepping stones, I'll just call them by American names, but these might differ. They certainly differ in Latin America. The stepping stones to being tenure and being a full professor, whether it's being an assistant, associate, or full professor, whether it's becoming a postdoc or not, whether it means going out of your country to study in one of the centers, say in the United States or in Europe. What are the gender imbalances in there? Furthermore, you can ask different questions there. You can ask questions such as, does it have to, how does it matter the ranking of the program that you go to? How does that interact with gender? How does the public versus private nature of the university interact with gender? How does it correlate with socioeconomic characteristics and bringing in aspects of intersectionality, such as ethnicity or race? These questions are going to differ according to the country. And so what we've commissioned here is these evidence-based papers that will hopefully be tackling various of these components, if not all of them. I guess I should have said also field of study, assignment of tasks in academia, how much mentoring men versus women receive, etc. So these evidence-based studies are going to be complemented by a far less quantitative focus, which is based on interviewing in depth men and women at various stages of their career to understand how these barriers in economics are seen and how they're lived. So this is work that's going to be done by a sociologist and her team. And it's really, to get a much more nuanced feel for what these barriers are than what is going to be revealed, say, by web scraping solely, or by looking at, male-female ratios, say, in undergraduate study. Then, to me, the most exciting part is our second call for papers, which is evaluating specific interventions on what might work to change the barriers that women face in economics. So here there's a lot of freedom. We will be evaluating proposals, I think, in a week from now. We received several. I'm sure we received from a few African countries, definitely from South Africa, I recall seeing. Received from Latin America and from India as well. So just to be absolutely clear, we are not doing either the evidence-based or the sociological or the interventions. We are commissioning papers for them. Okay. The other part, as I said, this had two big parts. One is this, creating evidence-based, coming up with new evidence. What are the facts? And also, what can we do to change the facts? The other part, I would say, is more for women who already exist as economists, and that is the amplifying women's voice component of our study. And there, the idea is to partner with global platforms and incentivize them or simply ask them to provide greater access to women economists. And so the idea, this is still in its infancy. I think we have 2 or 3 articles right now that are in the pipeline. The idea is to either solicit directly, or if one sees an interesting article, have those be given greater visibility in the economics platforms. One, in my opinion, important part to this, which we have not yet given any attention to, but I think that will change, is that we do this not only for the global platforms, which you might think global doesn't really mean global. It means US, Europe, and of course everybody pays attention to them, but still that doesn't make them global. It's also to do this locally. So, it's who are the voices who are considered experts when one wants to, talk to people about, say, unemployment in Ghana or in South Africa or in Argentina. Is it, to the extent that it's primarily male economists, maybe that is a problem, maybe it's not. In any case, we would like women to be seen as the experts in these areas. So it's important that they also have local platforms or space in the local media in which to speak. So that part is less well thought out. I think it's going to depend very much on the area expert to sort of make those links happen. And let me just stop with that. I want to spend 2 minutes. I think I have 2 more minutes. Let me spend 2 minutes just talking about the WELAC part. So as I said, WELAC is part of LACEA, the Latin American Caribbean Economic Association. It was created in 2018. I was vice president of WELAC then, and I put it forward, and it passed, and we have had it ever since. And what WELAC has done to date is we have had mentoring sessions, which I think almost everyone does. But also, we did a 10-country survey because we existed prior to this IEA-WE initiative, 10-country survey with local coordinators in each of these countries and looking at over 90 institutions in these countries to sort of find out what the facts are on the ground. And that's going to be coming out next. But then what I noticed is that none of these countries, with the really strange exception of Bolivia, and I can tell you why that's strange at some other point, with the exception of Bolivia, none of these countries at the national level had any women's association within their national economic association. That's kind of strange when you think about it. You know, CSWEP, the equivalent of the United States, has existed for 50 years, 50. WINE, Women in Economics, WINE, WINE, has existed for, I don't know, I'm going to say 15 years. Nothing like that exists in Latin America. So what I did was, with some help with other people, was to get in touch with people who are leaders in the kind of more feminist part of economics in these countries, but also extremely, I shouldn't say but, and also extremely good academics, and ask them to help create these organizations within the National Association, not as a separate entity, as part of the National Association. And that's something that I would like to talk to the rest of you about, because I think it's really important that that exists. So in our next meeting of LACEA, which will be in November, I have invited, with the money I have from Co-Impact and from Open Society Foundation, those are our two, the two organizations who are responsible for us having any funding to do this. I have invited them, and we are going to be identifying, along with everybody who attends a mentoring session, what the main obstacles are at a country level, and to see if we can come up with some common strategy, obviously tailored to the local circumstances, that might be useful, and that all of us can think about together. So that's a thought I'm going to leave you with, because at least when I looked, I didn't see this existing, for example, in South Africa. I'm not sure about Ghana, and I'm not sure about other African countries. But if this does not exist, this should be created. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raquel, for presenting the project to us and the two major interesting dimensions, and the third in particular, from Latin America. I would like to invite the panelists. I'm going to begin with Diopolo to respond. Yeah. In terms of your perceptions and your thoughts on this project and on the issue in general.
So thanks, and good afternoon, everybody, and good morning, depending on people who might be listening online. Women in economics and women who teach economics, and the way we participate in the economy and as practitioners, as knowledge creators, seems to present a few dilemmas. And I'd like to pose a few of them. The one is whether or not, as women in the economy and women who are interested in examining the world through the prism of economics, what does that world do to us? And I say this because not every woman who's in the economy and who's studying economics is a feminist. The second piece is, what do we do to the discipline? And I think there has to be some kind of a dialectical engagement. It cannot be that you are a woman who teaches economics and your course looks exactly the same as some white dude, to put it bluntly. It cannot be that you're not as engaged in and as embedded in different struggles and different ways of being and ways of thinking. And I've been standing at the intersection of both academia and activism for many years. And somebody asked me the question before, which was to say, I didn't know that you're an academic. And it's not an unfair point, because I think that we carry our activism, ideally, into the economics field. And I think that a space like IAFFE and a space like, a space like this offers us so much to co-create and to think through what that might potentially look like. And I'd also like to offer this, which is, how do you reshape the image of economics? How does that reshaping help us to rethink what economics are? How do we rethink a transdisciplinary way of viewing the economy? My view is that economics has to be porous. It has to understand that it is not in isolation. It stands in tandem with sociology, political science, digital economics at the moment, the Industrial Revolution. It stands in tandem with health, public health care. It stands in solidarity perhaps with other disciplines like political geography, like economic history, like women's studies, like women's human rights, and a whole load of other intersectional potential points of porousness. It stands in tandem with women in climate change and climate justice and ecology. So I think that in that regard, if we're reshaping the image of economics, that might be one way to think around it. The other piece I wanted to really think about is, how do we practice inclusivity in non-academic activities? Yeah? And that inclusivity could include, for example, who are our students engaging with? What kind of worlds are they imagining through the economy? How is that world then going to be infused in the sorts of students and the sorts of women and young men who emerge from our classroom? I think that when we look at, for example, the kinds of student struggles, and I'm going to use Fees Must Fall, which many of us in this country and beyond are well aware of, that was largely because of one of the protests and one of the demands was around decolonizing a particular kind of curriculum, including the economics curriculum. It was around rehistoricizing a particular kind of personhood inside that curriculum. It was also around young Black women and young Black men who wanted to see themselves in the readings, in the citations, who wanted to recognize themselves. So I think that when we ask, by saying that, what kind of inclusivity in non-academic activities are we thinking about, it also means then that we're going to run an excellent risk of producing radicalized students, students who are willing to challenge the status quo in different ways. The other point is this, one and only syndrome that a lot of people seem to be so in love with being the first and the only woman economics professor, so in love with being the only Black person in the room. I like seeing Black people in the room. It gives me comfort and a sense of community. I love being in a room full of women. It gives me a sense of strength, and it gives me hope, and it gives me a sense in which I'm not doing this by myself. But not everybody thinks that way. So one and only is a whole thing, and the Department of Economics is no exception to that. And that one and onlyness also means then that we run the risk of then producing the one and only way of seeing the world, the one and only way of imagining the world. We also run the risk of, this northern normativity, which I think Raquel spoke to really well. I get really impatient with folks, I hear you, with folks who come from different parts of the world claiming to be Africa experts, right? So the economist who come to Mozambique, he's Swedish, but he knows all about Mozambique. I don't have the levity to go to, even though I spent 16 years in the UK, it's really difficult for me to claim expertise on, European development, for example, even though I think I do have expertise in European development, as it happens, having studied political science in a European institution, I guess, right? So what does that actually mean? And lastly, it also speaks to the politics of citation. Who is being cited? Who is being remembered? Whose knowledge is being valorized and is being archived for posterity? Yep.
Thank you, Dipolo, for raising these issues, especially the one about the one and only person in the room. But it raises the issue of mentorship, doesn't it? And to what extent can mentorship contribute to increasing the presence of women in economics? I'd now like to invite Priscilla to make a few comments.
Hello. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this panel. I would like to, following Raquel's presentation, I see two key issues. So first of all, we are looking at young women selecting to be economics in the first place. So what are the barriers? And from where I'm coming from, I know that the key barriers are the demands for an individual to qualify. So I give an example. In the secondary school, you should have read elective mathematics to be admitted into an economics course. And young ladies would, at that point, usually, apart from the science students, would not normally read economics. So you find that a lot of them are reading economics in the secondary school, but they will not qualify for admission into the University of Ghana as economic students because they don't have additional mathematics. And that is something that we keep conscientizing people. There is a need for that kind of education. And so essentially at that point also, I think that like the one and only syndrome, there is the need for women in economics to be like the poster, quote and unquote, the poster child for the next generation, for people to relate and see that when they hear of economics, it is not a male face. When you hear economics, it's like which people come to mind. And I give a typical example, like you indicated, when we are talking about economic issues, which people would generally come to mind in South Africa, in Ghana, when they are asking for experts to share their opinions on national issues. Now, debt distress, debt crisis all over. Which people do we listen to? I have been, quote and unquote, been known to be notorious on the media space in Ghana. These days, I'm trying to shy away a bit. Because it appears if you are not careful, you are all over the place. But when you decide to also sit back and observe, and you watch these platforms, all the discussions that are going on, I do not find my kind on those panels. So you see on a Saturday morning, there's a discussion on the national economy. You flip all the channels and you don't see one female on any of the panels. So the question you ask is, where are the women economics in Ghana, for example, and where are the expertise? And most of the times, the men who are comfortably seated there discussing issues are making very basic errors, and people are clapping for them. So you see, it is more of an issue of, is it that I can also understand that it's difficult to juggle. I've got my papers to work on, I've got lectures and all that, and you have to make time for all these additional things that do not really count towards your work, really. So that is something that I believe mentorship is important, particularly for people who are in the profession, so that we do not consistently, we can take away the male image that automatically comes to the minds of people when we are discussing these issues. On the issue of when people are in the profession, I think that recognition is also one issue. Which people are we happy citing, for example? The recognition people get. There's evidence that on average, women who get published in top journals receive extreme scrutiny compared to their male counterparts. And the evidence is that when those papers are published, the number of citations from those female papers are way higher, indicating that there is an extra layer of scrutiny before women can break into that barrier. And in terms of the whole work environment, I believe that in the Department of Economics in Ghana, we have done well. We are how many? 6? Yes, a few also went on a PhD and did not return, but at least at the time of Professor Oduro, she was the only one. But I mean, the only one syndrome did not catch her. And so essentially now there are a number of young people. I don't see myself as young anymore, but I think that the future looks great. And I encourage that women economists should make themselves accessible to young people, graduate students, to see that they can do it. The struggles are real, I must say, juggling family and care and all that. We live in Africa, the expectations are there. But essentially, once that mentorship is created, it creates a can-do kind of spirit, because I always tell myself that I'm an example of mentorship. I did not just start my career thinking I wanted to do this. I was encouraged to really by a male, actually. And I also don't want us to see it as more like we against them. Indeed, it is more like a collaboration. It's not a zero-sum game. And I think that women should be given the opportunity, particularly for graduate students, to aspire to higher levels within the space. And that can be done when we, people who have tenureship, people who are making inroads in the profession, encourage younger ones to also pursue the same path. Thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla, for also bringing up the point that it's important for the women economists to be seen outside of, and I think you also alluded to it, outside of the classroom as well as within the classroom. And just as an aside, yes, we have 5 women economists in the department. We have 2 on study leave, and all the 5 of them are at this IAFFE conference. So, I would like to invite Daniela.
Thanks, Abena, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. So that one and only syndrome is sometimes referred to as the queen bee syndrome. You know, I'm at the top, no one else must come near me. Yeah. So I'm going to speak to what I know best, and I think which is why I was asked to join this panel, is that I've been a woman economist in academia, specifically in South Africa, for the last 25 years. So I have some sense of the system, the obstacles, but also the factors that have been supportive. Our system's a little bit different, so maybe I should just explain it. You could start out as a tutor, move on to being senior tutor, lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, and then the top of the pyramid is full professor. But you can actually get a permanent post or tenure at your, what you might call tenure at any point along that path. But you won't get promoted up that pyramid unless you meet the criteria, the most important of which is research. And it's all, unfortunately, all about quantity of your publications in South Africa, for better or worse. I've heard the rule of thumb is that from the time of PhD graduation to getting to full professorship, if you're working consistently and you're publishing, should be around 20 years on average in South Africa. Okay. Yeah, it's a long road. Now, as we know, many countries around the world, and in South Africa, it's the same. Many women are not getting to the top of that pyramid. Now, I don't have the hard stats for South Africa. That's why I'm really looking forward to this IEA Women in Economics project so that we can have this hard evidence that Raquel referred to. But I'm going to give you some sense from the institutions that I'm involved in. So of the 52 academics who work at the School of Economics and Finance at the University of the Witwatersrand, where I work in Johannesburg, 17 or 1/3 are women, which is more or less in line with some of the global estimates I'm seeing, not just out of the UK and the US, but the global estimates on, for example, REPEC, 1/3 approximately of the economists are women. Of those 17 women, only 3 are full professors. None of those 3 are South African-born black women. You know, this is South Africa, so it's terrible gender inequality, extreme race inequality. Yeah, another reason I was asked to be on this panel is because of the institutional link to the Economic Society of South Africa, of which I'm currently president-elect. When I become the president in September this year, it's going to coincide with the centenary celebrations and conference. So the society's been around for a while. And I went to look back at all the past presidents. Only 2 in almost 100 years have been women, one in the early 1990s, one in the early 2000s. Of the current 16 council members, only 5 are women. That includes me. And it's not that, you know, and this is the most gender balanced actually the council has been. And it's not for lack of trying in recent years. We really are trying. I've only been involved in the last 4 or 5, but I've been a member for the last 25. It's because there's just fewer academics to call on, right? There's this very leaky pipeline, and so there are fewer female academics, and there's the danger that we keep calling on the same fewer female academics to do this pro bono volunteer work, which detracts from what is promotable, which is their research, right? So it's a problem. There's actually a great study I saw probably in the US about how, you know, gender quotas in the academy can backfire. If you're always insisting on 50-50 representation, then it means the same fewer women are having to sit on every board meeting, every selection panel, every you know, there are many, you know, committee meeting. And those are non-promotable tasks. So there are policies that can have perverse effects, which we need to think carefully about. Even though we want women to be present in those fora, we need to actually reward them in the university system for that work, right? And then, so yes, we need lots of country-specific, context-specific evidence on what the obstacles are in the academy. But we also need to understand why women are not choosing economics in South Africa and in other countries around the world. Again, I don't have the hard evidence on the numbers, but I can give you some sense from, again, the Economic Society. We held our first national PhD conference at the beginning of this year, and it was a wonderful success. So the PhD students got one-on-one feedback from experts on their field on one of their PhD papers. They got to network with senior academics and people in the policy sphere, and we know how important that is for advancement in the profession. And of the 20 PhD participants, only 5 were women. And it wasn't because women had put in worse abstracts than men. Of the 50 abstracts we received, the vast, vast majority were from male PhD students. That was this year, okay? So we're not doing a good job at encouraging women to choose economics, and we're not doing a good job at getting them through to the PhD level. Now, okay, the bell's gone off. I have lots of thoughts on constraints and some of the factors that have also been supportive. But I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about those when we circle back in the next round, yeah.
Thank you very much for throwing some insight into the situation in South Africa. So now we've got 15 minutes for floor discussion. If we can have your questions, comments, observations, insights.
So I'm Liz Hind. I work for the UK Women's Budget Group, and I'm our partnerships and training officer. So it's my job to go up and train grassroots women's organisations. So I think that there's a very low level of understanding of economic ideas within grassroots female organisations at a time when the UK, we're having lots of economic conversations because we're going through a cost of living crisis, which we know at the Women's Budget Group is affecting women harder than it is men, and all the reasons why. So, I mean, well, I think it's really important what you're saying about, women in economic leadership. What can we do to make sure that where we do have those women leaders, that is leaving the walls of academia and getting into those grassroots women's organisations so that we can have proper public conversations about economics and public engagement within economics?
Hi, Jennifer Olmsted. I had two comments. One was just a reaction to the fact that CSWEP has been around a long time, but we haven't seen a dent in the female representation in the United States, despite having CSWEP for 50 years. So I think that's worth reflecting on. We've been at 1/3 since I got my PhD. It hasn't moved. And I also just wanted to make a comment about local versus global. And I find it interesting that this research project is focusing on the local contexts, because the market for economists is a global market, and a lot of economists who actually go back into their home regions are trained in Europe and the United States. And it seems to me that any kind of project that's going to look at the local environment also has to look at the global environment, and what kind of treatment do women who do make it into maybe graduate programs in the global north, how are they treated? And I will say I'm doing a project that's similar with Arab women in computing. The Arab world actually has very high rates of women in computing, and they actually face higher rates of sexism combined with racism when they go into US and European context than they do in their home context. So I think it's important that that lens think about the global context as well as the local. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Edith Kuiper. I had a few questions. I'm kind of, what I picked up on, I've been looking at the project of the International Economic Association, and it's very welcome. But I was a bit surprised because the approach is taken is a social science approach, right? You do research, what are the barriers? And you're looking for evidence-based results. My concern is a bit that it's going to take another 5 years. And then what kind of answers are we going to end up with? So through my work in feminist economics, I've always said we need to approach economics as a social institution. It's not only theories, it's not only research programs. This is a business. And this is a social organization, there's a power structure, the money comes from somewhere, we have clients, we produce stuff. And that seems to me a kind of a more practical approach to bring women in. Because when this would be an issue for corporation, and top of the corporation would decide we're going to have more women, man, they would just do it, right? They would make a strategic plan and to bring the women in, and they would make it happen. So I encourage us to kind of maybe take a bit more that kind of approach because I'm feeling a sense of urgency around this issue. We've tried CSWEP for like 20, 30 years. We can't wait another 20, 30 years before we have a critical mass in economics. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot for the project, by the way.
Thank you very much. I want to. Oh, sorry. Am I on the floor? Okay. Thank you very much to the panelists for sharing their views on the issues. I just wanted to make a contribution and also ask a question relating to what mentoring programs currently exist in some other institutions and how they've worked. so that maybe for those of us in Ghana, we might also consider those. What I wanted to contribute to was what Priscilla had mentioned before earlier about most of these young girls shying away from economics. From my view, is what we see at the university level is like a manifestation of what happens at the lower levels, right? Because like she said, by the time they actually, you need certain courses, to be able to read, economics at, even at the undergraduate level. So the question, what you actually see, who is teaching math at the junior secondary levels? Most of them are males. Even for economics, my economics teacher was a male. The whole, 3 years of my secondary education, he was a male. And my additional maths teacher was a male. So when you see these faces, growing up, you actually form some of these, biases that, maybe really math quantitative courses are not for females, right? I'm happy to mention that at our department, like those of us teaching the quantitative courses are actually females, and this was actually deliberate, so that most of these young girls would actually realize that if a woman is doing it, then maybe it's not like a difficult thing after all. So I'm thinking that maybe what we have to consider doing is to try to deal with the problem at the lower levels. Maybe I don't know what structures we can put in place to get this to happen. My question has to do with learning more about maybe in the South African case, because Priscilla and Oduro are both from Ghana, so it would be good to learn what mentoring structures or programs you have for both the undergraduate students and the graduate students. So perhaps we could also learn from you and take it back to our institutions. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks so much for this very awesome panel. My question is in terms of, so I'm an instructor at Colorado State University, but I'm originally from Brazil, and I teach a gender in the economy course. I have more than 100 students every semester, and none of them has economics as their major. They take it as a diversity course. And one of my tasks that I give to myself is to try to bring them to economics and try to understand what's blocking them from trying a career in this field. And a lot of the answers that I have in this very specific small reality of my classroom is that there are no programs in terms of high school or even elementary school like there is for women in STEM or women in science or women in labs. And every time that we approach this discussion, we always start talking about undergrad as the basic level in which it should try to approach them. So my question is, how can we go even before that? What strategies can we try to use to propose young girls that economics can be a great career, not only for them, but for them to try to make a change for the world and engage with policy and all of those other things that we would like to do as feminist economists? Thank you.
Thanks. So, given that we're sitting in the IAFFE meeting, I'm a little surprised that no one has mentioned the issue of what we actually do in economics. So, in the United States, our discussion about diversifying economics, at least part of it, is really about changing what we do, because there's a lot of evidence that people of color and women find the kind of deracinated, abstract, peopled economics that is presented in introductory and standard textbooks to be unappealing and uninteresting and not seem relevant to the world they live in. So I don't know if other people are aware of this program, but Raj Chetty has this undergraduate course at Harvard, for example, where he starts with social problems. He doesn't do any theory. Then he teaches students how to do some data analysis, and they see how data can be used to describe problems that they care about in the real world. And then eventually, they get around to some theory. And it's not actually an economics course, but it's like a bridge for people into economics before you get all that abstract stuff that you see, what might be relevant. And I think, that brings us back to what economics actually is and the kind of, iron grasp that neoclassical economics, which at the undergraduate level is from the 1950s, has on textbooks and so on. And the last piece of this is that, I think IAFFE exists, if I don't know my history wrong, because when more women started to enter economics, some of them wanted to do economics differently. But this kind of different approach to economics wasn't really welcomed within the AEA and hard to publish in mainstream economics journals. And so IAFFE was developed to create a space where people could do a different kind of economics that seemed more relevant to their life. And then publish it, in our journal, which I have to say now has a really whopping impact factor, and has really shown that this kind of economics can be important to the world. So I understand that the project is not to take action, right, but to study it. But I'm hoping that some of the people who are participating as your researchers and so on in the project will be people who come from diverse types of economics, and not everyone just out of the core mainstream who have decided that they find the mainstream approach appropriate, because I think that is a small section maybe, or at least only a section of women and people of color who are excluded now from the economics professions.
Okay, so we're going to have two quick interventions and then come back to the panel.
Hi, this is Radhika Balakrishnan. One thing to add to this conversation is that IAFFE also has a grant from Co-Impact to increase the participation in economics, not just women in economics, and we had a session yesterday trying to get a sense of what are the barriers that people have in their ability to do feminist economics, either as students, because there are not many places that teach it. And so I think I'm on that advisory committee, so I think there'll be some linkages to the two projects. But, one thing that came up yesterday and the day before is we did a summer school this year, and I think many of the people are here. And a few people asked me, it's like, there were no men in the summer school. They didn't apply. Right? This was a fully funded coming here to study feminist economics. So why is it that feminist economics is not appealing to a huge majority of male economics students? And so I think I agree that we need to change economics, but I think these parallel projects, and we just started, so we're not quite as far as IEA, but starting to work on that.
Thanks. So there are 2 or 3 points I want to make, and these are sort of more positive stories. But it has to do with the way in which significant male economists have sought to take forward this the agenda of having more women, and how we can then engage and expand that process. So I'll give you some examples. Shanta Devarajan, when he was a senior director of development economics at the World Bank, and he was, one of the things he did was to organize development economics lectures. Every single one of those that he organized was by a woman economist. So it wasn't like 30% or 50%, 100%. So that's one. When Amartya Sen was president of the International Economic Association, he wanted to bring in more gender voices. So he talked to Barbara Bergman and said, Barbara, from what I recall, will you organize one panel? Barbara, being the radical she is, decided to organize 4 panels. The whole day, we had a whole day in Athens in 1989. And they were very, very well attended. Subsequent to that, I was asked if I would organize, and I said, well, I brought in, Nancy and I, we organized in Tunisia, and we did a whole day. And in fact, we had a lot of male economists also speak in our panels. And they were very well attended because it was something different and new. I give you a 4th example. I was told actually by Shanta Devarajan that a lot of social science, male social scientists, this was several years ago, started signing a statement across the US to say we will not participate in any panel which has Of course, no women, but also not if only the chairperson is a woman. So it's not the token woman we want. Now, I don't know how far that list has gone. It's worth, I know political scientists signed it, I know Jim Scott signed it, and many economists signed it. It's worth finding out what happened to that list to take forward. And finally, just to mention about the IEA, in fact, IAFFE was made, I remember when I was vice president then and Bob Solo was the president, and I said, well, why can't IAFFE be an associate member? And we were made an associate member. We continued until we stopped paying the annual fee. So I remember raising this, it's there all the, why don't we join? It's a friendly association. It's a very important association, and it's relatively a friendlier one than the AEA is. So I'm just putting this out there. And if you're an associate member, you get to speak in the council, you influence decisions, and so on and so forth. So,
thank you very much. Thank you for all these interventions. So I'm going to ask the panel to respond, but we'll begin with Raquel. If you would like to respond first, please. We've got a total of 20 minutes for this session, so let's try and keep to it.
Thanks to all the comments. I think there's a lot of validity in many parts of them. So I'm not going to try to address, since I think just to be fair, I probably have 4 minutes or something like that, 4 or 5 minutes. So let me just take up the one that I thought that resonated throughout, which is, even in the United States, and, there hasn't been that much progress. I think actually has been progress, but not in the numbers, not in the sheer raw numbers. And if you look at the numbers, as someone said, sorry, I don't catch anyone's name, someone said, we're at 1/3. And that's kind of true more or less globally, as was mentioned by Daniela. Now, why is this? Why haven't we made this progress? Speaking only from the perspective of the United States, there has been progress in mathematics. There has been progress in computer science, and it's large relatively to economics. So it's not just math. Although I certainly appreciate the point that it is a big barrier if you haven't studied the math when you're in secondary school to what you can do later on. So, but it's really not just about math, because we see women becoming mathematicians or going on to have PhDs in mathematics and in computer science, and we do not see it in economics. I'm sorry, I don't know who said, and I completely agree, a lot of it is in what is taught. Now, for me, the edifice of economics is what originally got me interested in economics. I started in physics, and I found the edifice interesting. I don't think that's true for the vast majority of people. I also entered economics because I thought I was going to go back to Argentina, get involved in politics, and economics will legitimize what I wanted to say. So I saw it as a legitimizing device, and I see nothing wrong with that. But most people don't think that way. So one has to think about why other people who are not like one, which is bad because we have some sort of selection problem going on here, why don't they go on to economics? And I think a lot of it has to do with, the issues that are presented. So it's not necessarily about, oh, look what we can do with data, as someone was talking about Chetty's course, but also just seeing economics as relevant to one's life, not in the sense of deciding whether to buy an apple or an orange for lunch, but relevant to one's life in terms of, changing the world, changing society, tackling problems that we care about, whether it's, climate, or it's, health provision, or it's social security. But those things have to be made far less abstract and much more at the center of an undergraduate course than what they are now. So whoever said, economics seems to be in the grip of the 1950s neoclassical, yes, I think that they are in the grip, not so much, aside from the ideological perspective, it's really this formalization, which is really important in economics, but it shouldn't be the way that one enters necessarily economics. And that is what I would really change is what does economics mean to me? What does economics mean to us? Why should we study it? And less on, look at the efficiency of the market. Let's look at the price system. Let's do everything in general equilibrium. Isn't this beautiful? I like that. But that's not the point. The point is the majority of people do not find that appealing, especially women. So that is what I think we need to change. I also wanted to comment on the local versus global. Someone, I think early on said, well, look, it's great that it's local, but economics is global. There's so much that's done globally. I don't think we're doing local in particular. But when you think about the vast majority of people who go on to do economics in our countries, and by our, I'm going to mean Latin America, Africa, and India, they do not go and do a US PhD or a European PhD. In Latin America, you do a Latin American PhD, okay? I don't know how it is in Africa, but in Latin America, a lot of people stay and do one. They can't afford to go out. They're not chosen to go out. They have family. There's a lot of obstacles to that. So I certainly take the point that it should be two-pronged. I'm not sure how much we're going to do that, but I do think it's very important to change circumstances within a country as well as the US and as well as how these students are treated in the US and Europe. Unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is if you go to the US and Europe, and given the journal bias and given the professor bias that you have, you're going to end up working very often on US and European problems rather than in problems that are relevant necessarily to your societies. Okay, let me leave it to other people to also talk.
Thank you, Daniela.
Thank you. So many of the points I was going to talk about have come up, so maybe I can just re-emphasize some of them. So there was the story about, early on, and I think that's really important. I think that there's evidence to suggest that in some countries, girls score worse on mathematics tests than boys do, but it's not obviously because they have poor aptitude for it. A lot of it has to do with biased social messaging. So they're told that girls do worse than boys on the subject, so then it's self-fulfilling. It knocks their confidence. So confidence seems to be an important thing. And if you want to, I guess what's an intervention? Encouraging people to continue. There's also evidence coming out of the US that I think it was Claudia Golden's work on, girls or women students need a stronger grade signal to continue to choose economics as a major than boys do. So if they get an A in their principles course, they'll be more likely to choose economics as a major than boys, but less so if they get a B, right? So again, it's that story either about confidence or it's about maybe they are, preempting all those other barriers and obstacles and discrimination and aggression that they're going to face in a very male-dominated field. And then I wanted to talk about this very important issue that a number of people have raised about, what is off-putting to girls about economics or to women about economics. Now, we're a bunch of feminist economists. We've got all kinds of reasons about why it's off-putting. And if I think about my own experience, I would have dropped out of economics for sure had I not in my undergraduate training had one course on alternative economic perspectives, which in my third year introduced me to institutional economics and Marxism. I also took an elective outside of economics in a separate economic history department. The two didn't talk to each other, right? It was crazy. I had to fight to go out to learn about economic history. And then in my fourth year, I had a wonderful development economics professor who gave one lecture on feminist economics. Bina Agarwal's work, Diane Olson's work was Ludus Benaria, and then I was hooked. And then that's why I carried on. But I was the last of my cohort. It's so sad. All those courses no longer became available afterwards because the program just became so traditional and orthodox. So I just made it in. I wouldn't have had I not had access to those interesting pieces of work which changed the way I thought about the world. So are we changing the way people think about the world? Are we making it appealing to them? I don't think we are in many places, or many of us are constrained by what we're forced to teach. At WITS, my colleague Dory Posel and I have introduced a course in feminist economics at the master's level, which is fantastic that we've got to do this. It's a full semester course. But that's not enough because not all students are going to choose it. So whenever I teach a course, wherever, at whatever level, I always include one lecture on feminist economics so they know what it's about. So I think we just have to kind of put it everywhere so that we also reach the male students who must be allies in this project. I really want to just talk about now moving on to once you get into the academy, because this Women in Economics is very much more focused, I believe, on the academy. And I know others are going to talk about outside the academy. You know, when you're meant to be most productive, we're not talking about this yet, or we haven't yet in this session. When you're meant to be most productive, you're also having children often. And really, the kind of work, the mental effort that goes into doing research is often not compatible with looking after children, which is exhausting, right? And so, you know, I think that it becomes really difficult when you have both. And, you know, there's this really interesting work, I guess, about how, you know, women are trying to be, you know, they're supported, there's efforts to support them by stopping the tenure clock in the US. And then it backfires because women don't want to be seen as weak and they don't want to take on that extra time. And then it's given to both parents. And what happens? The fathers spend the time on their publications and the mothers spend the time on childcare. So again, perverse kind of effects. It's really tricky. We're not going to shift the needle on this unless we shift the needle on the division of labor in the home between men and women. And then I also wanted to say that, you know, childcare prevents you from taking up all kinds of other opportunities which are important. Networking. I'll finish this point. Can I finish this point? Networking, going to conferences, you know, going on research sabbaticals, all of those things. Fascinating study that during COVID, women's representation at staff seminars went up in the US because they were online and women didn't have to travel overnight away from family. So, you know, these are really important things that we all need to be thinking about. How can we make it easier for women to do both instead of having to choose?
Thank you. Sorry, I'm such a hard taskmaster, but I want us to go back to the floor as well. And Priscilla.
Okay, thank you. I think that the comments for us to take economics to the grassroots, it's very important. I believe that the whole idea that we are this removed group in living in our ivory towers and dealing with sophisticated abstract theories need to be demystified, and it's important. It's not easy. Like, how do you balance it? Because all these other activities you are doing do not count towards your promotion. It's all about research. Even the teaching that we are so committed to encourage young people to get on board, it's just in my university now, it doesn't even count. We've made effort to include teaching. With COVID and others, it's been suspended. So the core issue is to get the publication. And all these things are also conflicting with the time that one gets to dedicate to these activities. I give it, and sometimes you need to commit so much. I give a typical example. I am a regular panelist on a BBC Money and Work program. The program happens 1 a.m. Ghana time. So I have to set the alarm, wake up, and go talk for an hour and go back to sleep. You must be committed, and it's pro bono. You must be extremely committed to do something like this. But when you get emails of young girls, I listen to you, I am encouraged. It encourages you, but when you look on my CV, there's nothing on there that shows. So it's the additional commitment and the fact that you think that you are investing in something that you may not be a direct beneficiary, but it's important that you make that kind of, you influence people in that sense in terms of the younger generation. But for me, I think that the most important kind of mentorship is a women in economics, making ourselves accessible to younger people, the younger faculty, graduate students, and even undergraduate students with regards to what is possible, so that they see that this is not something that is extraordinary. We are not the only people that have done this, and it is possible. And I think that it's important that we bring the men on board, because like I keep saying, you cannot really beat them unless you join. And it's really not about a zero-sum game, really. It's about, together building a better society for everybody. So I think that mentorship is critical, for whether formally or informally, like Monica indicated. I think that we do it in silos, but I think it's important that as institutions, we formalize these kinds of things. Like Raquel indicated, in Ghana, there's a Women Economic Network, which I know Frederick Ebbe Foundation tries to build and promote. It's at a very nebulous stage, but I think that these are all ways that we can encourage young people to see a female face and hear a female voice whenever economics is mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. So I'm going to invite Diopolo.
So I'm going to piggyback on just 2 points that were made. The one is the point that was around leading to mobilization of grassroots work and grassroots organizations. The second is, I think, the point that was made relating to the status of women when they leave their own countries. It can only be described as academic racism. And the third I'm going to just throw in there for fun is the Chicago School. So the one is that economics has an important role to play in the analysis of contemporary national and global orders. And when I say global, I mean it in the sense of multipolar, multi-locational context and circumstances, yeah? And that it does lead to the question of what then is the ideological, political orientation and strategy of teaching economics if we're only producing a kind of economics, a singular form of economics. Hence, I mentioned the Chicago School, because that has been literally a factory of neoliberalism, of most of your World Bankism, your IMFism, and all the other isms you can think of. And one can't underestimate how extremely pernicious and how extremely overriding that worldview has become. And it's a minority view which has become normalized and majorityized, if that's good English, on a Friday afternoon. The second piece is also then, how then do we think around an intersectional economic theory? What does this mean if we're going to create a false binary between economics and the rest? And I think I love what I'm hearing around, for example, your experience with flirting with economic history and other disciplines, for example, and this notion that economics has to be porous in order for it to be more relatable. I would run away from things that have to do with mathematics and all of that, because I just don't think that it's enjoyable, but I also know that it is necessary. That said, I don't think that economics can only be around the numbers. It's about the story, the narrative that the numbers are telling. And this is exactly what the mainstream fails. It can't just be about a few digits. What's the story behind it? And bearing in mind that data is highly, it's highly interpretive as well. And the other piece, of course, is whether or not economics teaching should be decolonized is a contested topic. So let's be clear, what we are talking about here is the fact that the discipline of economics in its classical sense is the creation of white men in the US Academy predominantly, and to some extent the European Academy. And what does that mean for us who are neither white nor male, and in many cases neither white nor male? And what does that actually mean? It means then that we're going to be in a situation where, for example, you're trying to teach something that is not relevant, a methodology of macroeconomics, of interpretation, of data interpretation that comes from a context that is not relevant to Lesotho, to Malawi, to Rwanda. How can the Chicago method be used universally and understood to be normative? So I think there's a call to be made for a decolonial and deconstructive and dismantling and to understand that the economy has to be much more multipolar and has to understand multiple worldviews. Otherwise, we'll continue to be reproducing. Our grandchildren will be sitting in an IAFFE meeting in 30 years saying, oh my gosh, remember that time when? And they'll also be citing Adam Smith and all of these guys we don't really need to cite. So if we are not being cited in this room, then what does the future look like for her story in the future? That's about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we want to go back to the floor if you want to respond for comments. But then I do know we have online participants, and I made a mistake. I didn't refer to them. So can you check online to find out if there are any questions or comments from the online participants? In the meantime, as you're checking up on that, we've got 3 hands up. We start with Marlene right here.
Thank you. So I think this has been a great conversation. And people have talked about a lot of the problems that women face and feminist economists face. You know, there's so many things that are barriers with, you know, women and feminist economics is viewed differently. Our work is evaluated differently, as was mentioned. We do more service. We're less likely to be tenured, promoted as associate professor, but also full professor. We get less support, less mentoring, and a lot more sexual harassment. So women drop out because they can't make it or they can't stand the profession. So my question is, what can we do about this? Edith, who's here, turned me on to what's going on in STEM in Europe, and how you have to have a gender parity plan, and you in STEM. So there could be something similar, or you have to at least address gender if you get a grant. That could be something that some funders can do, which would put gender on the agenda, and it's already being done in Europe. So what can departments do? What can we do in our own department to increase racial diversity and get more women through our departments and have maybe formal mentoring programs. And my question here is what can IAFFE do? When I was first at a graduate school, fortunately IAFFE just started, and it served as a great network. It had a journal. These conferences were great. You could get feedback, and it was helpful to get feedback when you're in the job market. There's this whole network because, as one person said, she didn't know of a feminist economist that did not have trouble getting tenure. There's this whole network sharing the same lawyer when people were denied tenure. So I'm just wondering, I mean, that was done informally. I don't know if that's still needed. I know for people of color in the US, there's a DIET mentoring program for junior faculty for diversity in economics to help people get tenure and make it. I don't know if this would be helpful to people in IAFFE. I guess I know there's some people here who are almost at the job market or there. I don't know if that would be helpful. I'd like to hear from people what would be helpful to you. And this whole idea of multiple worldviews, of course, but how do we get there? How do we get feminist economics in textbooks, in the canon? How do we get it taught and respected? I don't know how to get there, but so I'm just throwing that out to you because that is crucial. Not only to get people to stay and to go into the profession, but to help us as well.
Yes, Lee?
Yeah, thanks. Lee Badgett. I'm on the American Economics Association's Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Professional Conduct, and so we've been thinking a lot about these issues, and it is really hard. But I'll tell you, the thing that we haven't really talked very much about is the men behaving badly problem. They still do. We have a lot of evidence of it. Women on our survey a couple of years ago reported high rates of experiences of discrimination and harassment. Women of color had super high rates. So, so there's definitely a problem there. There's, if you're not from the US, you may have never heard of the Economic Job Market Rumors site, but it is a cesspool in our profession, and there's not very much that anybody has figured out what to do about it. But it routinely disparages women and people of color and LGBT people, and there's, a lot of angst about it, but not a lot of ideas about how to stop it. And they often make threats against people. So, but I guess, so one thing that I'm hoping, like having a more comparative perspective, like you're doing, Raquel, I wonder about the kind of culture issue. This is also in the context of a culture that we also found kind of makes everybody miserable. It makes men miserable. We have, in the United States, the economics is very hierarchical. People feel very left out, even if they are white men. They do not feel very socially included. Or respected by and large. So that has, I suspect that has bred some of the resentment in our survey. I read all of the open-ended comments, and there are quite a few men who are under the impression that they have been told at some point that they must hire women, and that they can never be promoted because they are men, or that they're less likely to get good, I don't think they're worried too much about journal publications, but worried a lot about jobs, And so anyway, I would be very curious to know if there's a way that you can look at that cultural component to see, how much of that plays into the kind of experiences that women have.
Thank you. We have a question from somebody online, and the question is, how can IAFFE support women students and graduate research projects and teams in their programs? So Marlene put some questions to us, and there's this question as well. Would we get any responses from the floor? Because I would like to give Raquel the final word. So how can IAFFE support women? Any suggestions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Toko with the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. And they say, the most important kind of thing to remember is the personal is political and the political is personal. And so I'm somebody who doesn't have an economics background that suddenly found herself working with economists, essentially, and bringing a feminist lens, bringing in a climate activist lens as well. So I think part of the conversation that I've really enjoyed from my first IAFFE conference, I haven't been to one before, but I've followed online and the sessions, is really this point of making some of the content that's needed. Somebody said we need to speak the language. So we need to be able to have a conversation with the IMF, the World Bank, national ministries of finance. We need to speak the language, but we also need to be transformative in enabling them to hear us, or to begin to speak our language as feminist economists. And I think we do that by creating these circles. So by IAFFE bringing scholars together at different levels, and those of us that are in research, those of us that are in activist spaces, those of us that are academics, those of us that span all of those kind of, wear all of those hats. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing which we must praise IAFFE for doing is by bridging the language barrier. So bringing Global South together by having conferences and engagements where there is translation. And so we need to also be translating our work so that we are able to read each other's work and we can cite each other's work, especially if it's in other languages. And so to have this platform where we have translation, for example, is important, but also translating the text. And I think coming together and thinking about very basic introductory courses that can be done online, or, I mean, we have the facilities now to be able to offer very basic introductory, like the 2-day offer, but something that can happen. I think that would also, again, bridge a lot of the gaps. And the maths is a huge issue. It's a massive issue. I had to read Olivia Blanchett for the first time, and calculus I did when I was 16, if I even remember, and I have to engage with it. It is a barrier. And we have to be able to reading this stuff because this is what our Ministry of Finances are reading and engaging with. So again, the translating the content into more accessible language becomes important. So not just language translation, but actually translating some of these texts that are influencing people in power to make these decisions. So I think that's something that IAFFE could do.
Thank you very much. I see that Murray had his hand up. And then I think I'm going to make Marie's the last contribution so we can have the last word coming also from Raquel.
Thank you. It was just a commercial, really. It was just to say that that IAFFE has applied to once again become a part of the IEA. Somebody referred to that, to the long history. That application is been processed already, I think. And of course, the IEA would be delighted to have IAFFE back in the fold. Yeah, the application went in this year. And I just wanted to make reference to the core curriculum as an alternative economics curriculum. The IEA is integrally involved, but many of us in the room are integrally involved in building this core curriculum, and it is something of a partnership for an alternative, real-world-based curriculum in economics. Wendy Carlin leads it from the IEA side. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Raquel to come back in. Raquel, if you don't mind, I give you 5 minutes.
Okay. Wonderful. So another good round of comments. Let me circle back to a few things that I think we didn't talk about enough. One was, I think it was Priscilla who was talking about, I'm sorry if I'm wrong, about participating in panels, as an expert. And then seeing a lot of men when she turned on the TV. And if I have it wrong, please just correct me. You've now all disappeared from screen. But in any case, I think that, and I suffer from the same problem. There's a lot of emphasis in feeling, I think, particularly for women, that one needs to be an expert to talk. But as she said, a lot of the men that were talking were saying things that were not correct. And I'm not trying to encourage women to go and say things that are not right. But I do think it's important that we don't feel that we have to be such an expert in order to voice an opinion. In the US, I think I only hear Betsy Stevenson talking all the time, or Claudia Golden on women's type of issues. And that's really quite sad. Not only necessarily because I may not agree with their views, but also just because why only 2 women? What happened to the rest? then I think there's this desire to be an expert when one is speaking, which means one can only talk about one's few papers. Let's face it, we've only written a few papers, even if there are 40, you know, we're lucky. That's still a few papers. You're not going to be an expert except in a very small area. One should be able to talk about other things too, to the same extent that men do. So I would like to encourage that. And I think that's something one has to train women in, and I would like to be part of that. I need the training myself, but that's something I'd like to change for Latin America, for the Latin American context, but also for the American context. The other thing is mentoring sessions. You know, I think it's wonderful that I don't know if IAFFE has mentoring sessions alongside this conference. It seems like a wonderful opportunity, but also with the national associations. I think I was met with silence, basically, when I suggested that it would be good if South Africa had the South African Economic Association had a women's committee that monitored the status of women, that looked at, that made sure that when you have plenary speakers, a good proportion of them are also women. That that legitimizes some issues that might, call them feminist or otherwise, that might otherwise be ignored. I think it's important that those women associations exist, and that one of those things that the Women Association should do, and men should participate in the Women's Association or the Women's Committee, is to have mentoring sessions. And in Latin America, we certainly have mentoring sessions, and they have a work-life balance component, how to publish component, how to get grants component, teaching and problems associated with that type of component, in which we discuss all these things that we've been discussing here, including not doing, non-tenurable work, what it means, how does one get invited to conferences, etc. Those are things that we can pass on, particularly those of us who are more seasoned academics. We can certainly pass on our lessons to others. I think that that's the main thing I'd like to say. The only other comment I would make is I think that the International Economic Association is a good association. I find it incredibly hierarchical and relatively sexist. So I would certainly say definitely join. I really hope the IEA doesn't hear this, but definitely join. But I'm not sure that this should be the end all and be all for things. I do think that the culture of hierarchy pervades economics, as someone was saying. I don't know how to change that except to try not to be hierarchical myself, and in the organizations that I'm part of, fight against this hierarchical view. And I do think it's really important, because when women talk in the United States, we end up having the same 5 voices each time. And it's very hard to get rid of that hierarchy of being, are you the top 5? Are you in a top 5 department? NYU, I think, is considered a top 10 department, but NYU is not MIT or Harvard or Princeton or Yale. And one needs to fight for space. And imagine if you're not from any of those departments and from your University of, Kentucky, in the United States, you have to fight a lot more for the space. And it is a very difficult profession, much more so than others, in my opinion. Yeah. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Raquel. And on the issue of mentoring, just to let you know that IAFFE does have a mentoring program. Okay, we've come to the end, but I have 2 important announcements. The first is that somebody has lost their iPhone. So if you've come across an iPhone, can you please give it to me? And then I will make sure the person who has misplaced the iPhone gets it. So that's the first announcement. The second is to do with the dinner for today. So if you have paid for the conference dinner, please pick up your ticket from the registration area, and the bus will collect all dinner participants from the entrance of the Waterfront Protea Hotel and not the conference venue. So go to the hotel to be picked up. And departure time is 6:45. So, I beg your pardon? I can't hear you. Yeah, I asked about that. So just to say thank you very much, Raquel. Thank you. And thank you also to the participants. Thank you, not to the participants, to the panelists. Thank you all very much. And of course, to the participants for your engagement in this session. So we're looking forward to a nice, warm dinner and also to see you all tomorrow morning, I think at 8:30. Thank you.